Hello, and welcome to our Good Friday reflection. Whether you're listening to this as part of a personal quiet time or you've gathered with others for a worship service, we hope that this message helps bring some focus and clarity to the significance of today. There's a cemetery located near my home, and from time to time, my wife and I like to take walks through it. And that may sound a little dark, but I can promise you we aren't trying to be macabre in any way. It just happens to be a quiet, low-traffic place for us to walk. The tombstones also make for some interesting conversation. There are almost 2 centuries worth of history buried in that place. Now, originally, we had hoped to film the message from that cemetery, but the weather just wouldn't cooperate. I thought it would have been a fitting setting to talk about Good Friday, not because today was the day of Christ's death, and not because he himself was buried in a tomb afterward, though those probably would have been good themes to draw from. No, I wanted to film there because of what is engraved on many of the tombstones. Epitaphs. They aren't written on all of the stones, but many of them have something inscribed on them in memory of the deceased. Loving father, devoted wife. For couples, treasured life together. These are the words that define how these people are remembered. Of all the stories or all the qualities, of all the characteristics that friends and family could have chosen to remember the deceased by, they chose these: love, devotion, commitment, and so on. We will all be defined by something. As a memory, others get to choose what defines us, but in life today, that decision is up to us. For some, it's our faith. For others, it's a career. For others still, it's a relationship or an achievement, or even a single moment. What I often find for all of us, however, is the strong temptation to allow our crosses to define us. So what do I mean by that? Well, think about this common phrase: it's my cross to bear. And maybe it isn't used commonly today, but it's still used frequently enough that we get what it means. We say this to describe a burden that we have to shoulder or some unique difficulty that we have to tend with. Personally, I often make use of this phrase facetiously to describe some uniquely positive experience. If I have to finish off the rest of the ice cream, then I guess I will. It's just my cross to bear. But in its origin, this is a phrase that describes a burden. It might describe an ongoing illness that complicates your life. Or maybe an aging or mentally ill family member has been left to your care, and you love them dearly, but their condition is challenging and draining. Maybe you had a rough childhood, and home wasn't a loving place, and you carry some hurt and some wounds around with you because of that. These are the burdens and the crosses we bear in our lives. And as I said, it can be tempting to allow those crosses to define us. Ebony Kelly is a woman who begins telling her story with a powerful confession. It wasn't long ago that I lived my life as a professional victim, she says. As a child, Ebony grew up in a home plagued by sexual abuse and domestic violence. She couldn't reconcile why some children were born into homes where they were loved and adored, while others were used and abused. And resentment began to seize her heart. As an adult, her burden would color her relationships and her perceptions of others. It colored her sense of self-understanding and worth. She had allowed her cross to define nearly every aspect of her story. It owned her, in a sense. And sometimes we fall into that same practice. We allow our burdens and crosses to define us. Seasons of our lives, and sometimes our entire lives, are colored by these crosses. But Jesus gives us an interesting instruction on what we're to do with our crosses in Matthew chapter 16. In verse 24, he writes, "Then Jesus said to his disciples, 'Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me.'" We are to take up our crosses and follow Jesus. And sometimes we have a specific idea of what that entails. Maybe that means giving up a bad habit, like cussing, drinking, etc. It's hard, but we're going to take up our cross and follow. And maybe that means incorporating an unwanted but spiritually healthy practice, like morning quiet time, prayer, tithing, is hard, but we are denying ourselves to follow Jesus. And oftentimes, we interpret Jesus' command as a call to behavior change. But what if it goes deeper than that? A man named Simon of Cyrene helps us understand these words of Jesus through his very literal experience of carrying his cross. We read his story in all three of the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But Mark actually gives us the most information on him. Mark chapter 15, verses 20 through 21, and this is speaking of Jesus. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. That's it. This is all the information that the Bible has to offer on Simon of Cyrene. But honestly, it's enough to paint for us a pretty impactful picture. So who was this guy? It says he was from the city of Cyrene, which was located in North Africa in modern-day Libya. So he wasn't native to Jerusalem. So why was he there? Well, we aren't positive. This story takes place during the Passover feast, which was the most significant of the Jewish festivals. And it was very common for pilgrims to travel to the city for the celebration. In fact, Jewish scholar Joachim Jeremias estimated that Jerusalem in the days of Jesus had a normal population between 20 and 30,000 people. But during the Passover festival, it may have swelled with as many as 150,000 additional pilgrims. It should also be noted that Cyrene was known to have a prominent Jewish population living in the city. And we can't know for sure, but there was a good chance that Simon was a follower of the God of Israel and was in town to worship that day. Mark tells us that Simon was on his way in from the country. Now, because there were so many people filling the city during the festival, it was common for pilgrims to stay in the nearby villages outside of the city. For instance, it's likely that Jesus stayed in the town of Bethany, where his friends Lazarus, Mary, and Martha lived. And Simon may have been just arriving into the city from his commute. And that small detail adds a significant dimension to his experience. A while back, I was coming home from work. It had been a busy day at the end of a busy week, and so my brain was just kind of done as I pulled into the driveway. I walked up the stairs and opened the back door, only to be met immediately with my two boys, both rushing toward me, both asking different questions, both competing for my attention with increasing volume, and it was overwhelming, to say the least. And maybe you've been in a similar sort of situation. Maybe your own kids, or maybe as you walked into work one day, it was an instant all-hands-on-deck situation. That's sort of how I imagine Simon's experience. After a leisurely commute into the city, the last thing he anticipated was being thrown into the thick of a situation like this. Needless to say, Simon was not expecting to carry a cross that day. He didn't wake up and start listening to his cross-carrying playlist to get himself psyched up and in the mood. He wasn't able to stretch his muscles or emotionally prepare himself for the task that was thrust upon him. And that too adds an important dimension to this. Not only was this cross unexpected, but it was also unelected. Simon did not choose to carry this cross. He was seized, as Luke puts it. He was forced, according to Matthew and Mark, to carry the cross behind Jesus. Unexpected and unelected. That's often how our crosses fall upon us. Disease, injury, unemployment, poverty, heartbreak, loss, failure. The list goes on and on. We don't want these burdens in our lives. We didn't expect these things to happen to us, but they do. We are seized by our circumstances and we're forced to bear these crosses. Lindsay and I know a couple from college who have a beautiful family of three little kids, but they used to have four. They were traveling home after one Thanksgiving holiday. The roads were slick in Colorado, and a speeding car rear-ended their vehicle. They were all banged up, but their 10-year-old son, Gabriel, took the brunt of it. It resulted in a coma from which he would not wake up. Now, our friends, John and Jenny, had to bear the unelected, unexpected cross of losing their son. Those are the kinds of things that crush people. And those are the kinds of burdens that people carry around with them, sometimes forever. And the details of our circumstances may look different, but the burdens, the crosses we bear come upon us just as suddenly and unexpectedly. And pain or sorrow or anger that accompany them have just as much potential to claim ownership and shape our lives. But here's the thing. As tempting as it is to let our crosses define us, we don't actually desire that. I've looked around the cemetery by my house and read a lot of epitaphs on these headstones, but I have yet to find one that mentions anything about disease, unemployment, divorce, injury, a failed business, an addiction, growing up with crummy parents, or any of the other crosses that are often unexpectedly thrown on our backs. Deep down, we don't want to be defined by these things. We want to be remembered for something else besides how we struggled or wrestled or fell. These stones in this cemetery are the evidence that we want to be remembered for something better after we die. So then why are we so tempted to let our crosses define us today while we're still alive? Especially when there's a different option. Again, when we look at Simon of Cyrene, he helps us gain some understanding. It's such a small detail that we're tempted to pass over it completely, but Mark gives us one more insight into who Simon was. Again, Mark chapter 15, verse 21. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. Mark makes it a point to tell us who Simon's kids are, Alexander and Rufus. Why does he do that? I mean, if I were to meet you for the first time and introduce myself as Levi and Ben's dad, that probably wouldn't make a lick of difference to you. Like, who cares? The only way that information would grant you any clarity or benefit was if you already knew who my sons were. And the same thing is true here. Whoever Mark is writing to already knows who Alexander and Rufus are. So maybe we should ask, who is Mark writing to? Well, tradition holds that Mark's primary source for his gospel is the Apostle Peter, who is reported to have been martyred in Rome around the same time that Mark's gospel is supposed to have been written. So when we read some of the Apostle Paul's last letters, they indicate that Mark would have been headed to Rome soon, around that time. And there are a few different passages, actually, that lead us to believe that Mark wrote his gospel alongside the Apostle Peter in the city of Rome. And that's what makes a small and seemingly insignificant passage at the end of the book of Romans so very interesting for us today. Paul is wrapping up his letter to the church there with a list of greetings. And he writes this in Romans chapter 16, verse 13. Greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother, who has been a mother to me too. Rufus, who was chosen in the Lord, was the son of Simon. Rufus's mom had presumably been the wife of Simon, who may be deceased by this time. Simon had a cross thrust upon him unwillingly and unexpectedly, but it didn't crush him. That burden didn't even define him. If you look again at how Mark identifies Simon, he's not called Simon who carried the cross of Jesus. No, he's called Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Simon is not identified by the unexpected, unelected burden that he bore. He's identified by his children and the lineage of faith that resulted from it. He's identified, in other words, not by his cross, but by how he responded to that cross. He followed Jesus. I don't think it's an accident that in his telling, Luke makes it a point to say in chapter 23, verse 26, they placed the cross on his back and made him carry it behind Jesus. I think that it's a very intentional detail Luke shares. Simon literally took up his cross, his unelected, unexpected burden, and followed after Jesus with it. In the face of sadness and longing, we choose joy and kindness today. That's how our friends John and Jenny chose to respond to the cross thrust upon them on what would have been their son's 12th birthday. They chose to do random acts of kindness to bless other people. It's not their unelected, unexpected grief that defines them. It's their faithfulness and their hope in Christ. They're not defined by the cross they bore, but in how they responded and how they took up their cross and followed after Jesus with it. In our lives, it's so tempting to become victims of our circumstances. We probably resent that label, but it's true. I've met far too many people in my time pastoring who allow unexpected, unelected crosses to define them as victims. People with crummy childhoods close off their hearts and refuse to feel because they don't want to get hurt again. Those with physical ailments or impairments are held back by limitations of their own making, really. Those who have failed in business or relationships are shackled by the fear of failing again. And certainly our experiences are going to color our lives and inform our lives and shape us in varying ways. But too often we give our crosses too much power, and we let them become the centerpiece of our story. But Simon, he's not defined by his cross. He's defined by how he carried his cross after Jesus and produced a heritage of faith. John and Jenny, they aren't defined by their grief. They're defined by how they picked up their grief and followed after Jesus with it, blessing countless people through their testimony. Even Jesus. Jesus, for whom the cross is so integral to his story, he's not defined by the cross. The cross is an instrument of shame, and Jesus endured that shame, but he isn't defined by it. Not when he now sits in glory. And the cross was a symbol of defeat, and he endured that defeat for a time, but he certainly isn't defined by it. Not when he now reigns in victory. The cross was a tool of death. And today, of all days, we recognize that Jesus suffered that death, but he is not defined by it. If he were, I'm not so sure that we'd be calling this Good Friday. No, how could Jesus be defined by his death when today he is raised and alive? The cross was a necessary part of Jesus' story. But if it had crushed him, if it had owned him and defined him as its victim, we wouldn't be worshiping him. The cross was an important part of Simon's story. It changed the entire trajectory of his life. But if that's where he had stopped, if he had not responded in faith, I'm not so sure we would even remember him. Their cross is an important part of John and Jenny's story. It was a defining moment that galvanized their hope in Christ. But if they had crumbled under the weight of their circumstances, their story would fill my heart with grief instead of thankfulness and admiration. And our crosses, whatever they may be, are important parts of our story. But they don't get to be the star of the show. They don't deserve to define us. They only deserve to be opportunities for response. Moments of decision where we refuse to be victims and instead choose to be victors as we take them up and carry them, following after Jesus. Now, believing that takes some faith, I know, but we have a reason for that faith. We have a reason to believe that the cross was not the defining moment of Jesus' story, but rather just a pathway for it to move forward to its rightful conclusion. It's the same reason we believe that every one of the gravestones in every cemetery will be emptied and raised someday. It's the reason that this coming Sunday is the most important day of the year for us. It's Easter. And we hope that you'll make it a point to join with us on that day to worship the Lord and be reminded why we can have this faith, even when unelected, unexpected crosses are thrust upon us.